Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Kristen Talbot. I'm the program manager for MAVEN Project. Thank you all for joining us today and our friends at El Rio FMP for hosting today's session, Concussions with Dr. Richard Rapport. Dr. Rapport was a staff neurosurgeon at Group Health Cooperative in Seattle for nearly 3 decades. He then joined the Faculty of Medicine at University of Washington School of Medicine and helped to manage the service at Harborview Medical Center until he retired in 2020. He now teaches at Washington State University Elson S. Floyd College of Medicine, and we're just very, very lucky to have him as one of our MAVEN Project volunteers. All right, I will pull up your slide deck, Dr. Rapport, and turn it over to you.
Right. Thank you very much. Okay. Concussions, the definition of concussions and the precautions taken to avoid them have changed rather dramatically in the last 10 years or so. I will tell you that when I was in high school and college, I played football. I probably wouldn't do that again, but in those days, if you got what the coach called a ding, which meant that you were momentarily confused, he would hold up some fingers in front of your face and ask you how many there were. And no matter what you answered, he put you back in the game. So people don't do that anymore. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, we can run through these. Next. Okay, so it's been recognized now for probably 10 years or maybe more that a concussion is not necessarily a benign event. It's a mild TBI. And it is usually caused by a blow to the body or to the head, a fall, or something else that shakes your brain around inside your skull. And of course, your brain is floating in a puddle of spinal fluid. And if it bangs up against the bone, there are sometimes bad consequences to that. By definition, a concussion does not include an anatomical dysfunction that can be imaged. In other words, if you have a concussion and you have an MR, it's going to look perfectly normal, but it might not down the line, and we'll talk about that later. Although you can lose consciousness from concussion, that isn't necessarily part of the definition. Next slide, please. So here's what happens. There's your brain floating around in its puddle of spinal fluid, and it either rocks back and forth or it rotates. And when that happens, it can produce what we call concussion. Next. Concussion is a fairly big problem. Next. I won't read through all of these. You can look at it yourself, but there's lots of TBI-related deaths and hospitalizations, 1.4 million a year. It's probably more than that now. A lot of these are sports and recreational. Mountain biking out here in Seattle is a big cause of it. Is young 18-year-old males and even some females now who go roaring down a mountainside as fast as they can on a mountain bike, not infrequently fall off. This induces an enormous cost to healthcare. And it is complicated further by the fact that if you're an athlete, you want to go back in the game. And particularly if you're a high-powered college athlete these days, because lots of times for these kids, being a great football player is a way out of whatever they started in. Next, please. So 52,000 deaths, 275,000 hospitalizations, more than 1.3 million ED visits, and unknown how many people were perhaps injured and didn't know it. Next, please. It's no secret what causes these things, mostly falls, but also MVAs, fights, blasts in war zones are a big one. And then sports are a major one. And I want to just say at the top here, I really have to give a shout out to the NFL because the NFL has taken this seriously and they have done something about it. Those blue tents that the players go into if something happens to them are manned by people who don't work for the team, so they're impartial. And if somebody gets concussed and it's obvious, they're going to be told that and they can't go back in. Infants and children are at great risk, children and young adults, older adults who fall down. Next, please. External causes. We've already said falls, but also being struck. MVAs are, of course, a big one. Assault, more and more and more. People seem to be beating each other up out of stupidity. Next, please. Oh, yeah, here is what happens to athletes. This young woman is getting a knee from a competitor in her face. The business of football you see all the time. I mean, it's just become such a violent sport. When when I went to a small college. I played at fullback at about 180, and the biggest guy in our team was 235. Now people weigh 235 who are running backs, and the linemen weigh 350 pounds. So that's a big force coming together. Next, please. Uh, yeah, we've seen that already. Next, please. So these are sports-related TBIs. It's a little weird, really. Bicycling, I wouldn't necessarily have thought that that many people would have gotten traumatic brain injuries bicycling. Football's understandable. Baseball, hockey, horseback riding, I guess people fall off. Um, all the rest of these things produce the number of TBIs per year associated with them. Bowling, for heaven's sakes. I'm not sure how you hurt yourself bowling unless you've been drinking too much at the same time. Next, please. Oh, yeah. This, let's see. This guy was the director of the NFL at the time I made this. And he was being accused at the time of not taking care of the players. All of that has really changed over the last few years, as I have said. And I think that's very admirable. They're protecting their players. Next, please. Blasts in times of combat also produce TBIs, and so military people who are in action are also at great risk. Next, please. Peter Corelli was a general, and years ago he gave a talk out here who was talking about this topic, and the wounded were not insignificant, and that was important to the military, and they tried to do something about it. Next, please. What are the symptoms of concussion? Next. So the I put duration of symptoms variable. It's very variable. It can be a couple of days, can be up to 3 or 4 months. And the longer it goes on, the more anxious the patient becomes. In my experience, concussions always get better unless we get into the realm of CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Most people who are concussed recover completely, and the constellation of symptoms include physical, cognitive, emotional, and sleep-related. In the physical, we'll talk about this later too, most of it is balance. Next, please. So headache, problems with vision, nausea and vomiting, dizziness, as I said, sensitivity to light or noise, balance problems, etc. They have no energy and they are usually very worried. People who get concussed keep coming back and back and back time again to see you because they're worried that they're not better yet. Next, please. In terms of thinking, they will tell you they're foggy or slowed down or can't concentrate, particularly can't concentrate, can't remember new information, and answer slowly. And again, they're very worried about all of this with good reason. They don't know what's going to happen to them. Next. There's great emotional change, particularly in children, because they have no clue why they're having trouble. So they're upset, sad, nervous, more emotional, particularly kids than usual. Next. Sleep is a huge problem because they can either sleep more or less than normal. They have a hard time falling asleep, and sometimes they have a hard time waking up. Next, please. In young children, in addition to the emotionality, they cry, they complain constantly of headache, they can't play or get along with others or nurse or sleep. They have temper tantrums, they lose interest in their usual activities. Sometimes they lose the skills they've already had and start pooping in their pants again, and they can't pay attention. Next. So I show you this because it's important that you know you can't always rely on imaging. This was a patient of mine years ago who had a concussion and he got this CT scan, which looks wildly abnormal, but it's not. It's congenital hydrocephalus. And you can prove that because the cortical margins outlined by spinal fluid are easily identifiable. So there's just no way by imaging to see a concussion. You can see CTE sometimes, and we'll get to that later. Next, please. After a concussion, people have trouble with concentration and memory. They complain, as I've said, of headache, sleep changes, personality changes. Regrettably, sometimes their sex drive disappears, and they complain a lot of dizziness, lightheadedness, and unsteadiness. Next. So we'll talk about what a concussion actually is, how big a problem, which we have, and how a concussion is diagnosed and evaluated. Next, please. A complete neurological examination is important, and of those things that we do in neuro exams, the most important is balance. Balance is what goes in people who are significantly concussed, but also changes in reflexes can occur, changes in sensation and speech, and learning and memory. Imaging, I can tell you that if you're in the Army or in the military service anywhere, and you are diagnosed with a concussion, you get an MRI. And that is how we have learned as much as we have about CTE, because all of those people got MRs. And one of the women in our department, who's a researcher, has all of them. And she and somebody at Boston University who is working on the pathology, the gross pathology of CTE. Between the two of them, I think they will have this worked out soon. Next, please. People need to be observed, sometimes in the ED, that's fine. Sometimes they need to be admitted. If they get worse headaches or seizures or focal signs, they need to be admitted. If you can't wake them up, if they can't stop puking, all of these things, particularly loss of consciousness, again, if they have any of those things, they should be kept in the hospital. Next. second impact, we'll talk a little bit about that too. This was a kid who got concussed. The coach put him back in, and then he got this, I don't know if this acute subdural. So second impact syndrome is a real thing too. This wound up in an emergent hemicraniectomy to relieve the pressure. See how much he shifted here. He shifted over about a centimeter. Next, please. So that's again just second impact. You're more susceptible if you've been concussed. Next. How do we treat concussion? Next. Rest is best, and people don't like to hear that. And if you're some sort of a high-powered person who's got a good job that's important to you, you don't want to be told that you can't go back to work for a week. But that's how you get better. Plenty of sleep, avoid alcohol. That's a good idea in general anyway, and certainly illegal drugs. You want to avoid exercise and activity. You need to give yourself time to get better, and people just don't want to hear that. And sometimes if people aren't getting better, you can get neuropsychological testing, although I have to say, in my experience, that doesn't generally offer much help. Next, please. Factors that complicate concussion, definitely a previous concussion and definitely one within 3 or 4 months of the second. That is a setup for CTE. History of migraine seems to make things worse. ADHD and prior learning disabilities make it harder to recover. And a psychiatric history also make it harder to recover and take longer. Next. As I've said before, the NFL has taken this quite seriously. You have to protect the extreme competitors from themselves, and I think the NFL actually has done a beautiful job of doing that. They have done it by hiring consultants, neurologists, and sometimes neurosurgeons who are not affiliated with the team, so there's nothing in it for them. And so if one of those people says you can't play, you can't play. Next. Here's a breakdown of what produces these things. I won't read them all. Soccer, both in men and women, seems to be a big producer of concussion, more than football. Girls volleyball is right up there too, although I'm not sure what they do. They must, leap up and then fall down trying to spike the ball. Anyway, sports produce a lot of concussions. Next, please. If anybody has ever seen Australian rules football, you would wonder why it isn't 100% of a sports-related injury, because those people are nuts. They wear essentially no protection and they run into each other as hard as they can. But other things that you wouldn't necessarily think of, golf, for heaven's sakes, netball, rafting, all of these things produce a situation in which you can fall and hit your head. Next. This is from an NCAA summary, which is now about 20 years old, but it describes the injury rate per exposure. And women's ice hockey is right up there, and men's lacrosse, also men's ice hockey, and football, of course. Next. Lots of concussions in sports. Women have an increased incidence in versus men in the same sport, and I suppose that's because they're smaller and not quite as strong. But it can include all the rest of this stuff: reporting bias, head size, neck strength, and hormones. Next, please. So there's no real evidence for when a injured person can return to play. It's just judgment and experience. Next. There are two kinds of guidelines, Canto and the American Academy of Neurology. Out here, we use the American Academy of Neurology, and you can find these lots of places. It has to do with confusion for less than 15 minutes, other symptoms that last longer than 15 minutes without loss of consciousness, and loss of consciousness even for a few seconds. Next. People shouldn't really go back to play until they are completely symptom-free and their cognition has returned to normal. And then gradual return to play in the list below. It's mostly common sense. Next, please. I'm going to tell you where this came from in a minute. The high school is easy. When in doubt, sit them out. You can't subject a young person to something that may change their life forever. College and pros, if you have a concussion, you have to stay out for a prescribed period of time. In the Army, you have to also be out of combat, certainly, and out of any rigorous duty until the symptoms go away. Next. 3 or more concussions, I think that's down now to 2 in a season. You got to sit out for the season and maybe permanently. If you got blood in the head, you got to sit out for a year. And then the MRI and neuropsych testing has to be normal after that. Next. The NFL has these disqualifiers, and that's what they're checking for when these big-time athletes go into the blue tent. Women have a little harder time recovering from these things. Next. There's an assessment tool. There are a couple of them actually, and you can find them online. They are more or less useful, but actually I think the most useful thing in taking care of people with concussion is experience. If you're a family doctor and you see 1 concussion in 5 years, then you might want to get some help. Next, please. This is a test used by doctors and nurses to evaluate concussion. It takes 20 minutes to administer, and I'm not sure it's of great use. Next. This is, though, testing balance I have found to be the most useful thing in evaluating concussion. If you ask somebody to stand with their 2 feet together or on one leg or even in tandem like this, and they lose their balance, that's a very good indication that they've been significantly concussed. Next. Gradual return of play goes from no activity to light exercise to sports-specific activity to no contact, and then full return to play and practice. And that, again, is common sense. Next, please. So how do you prevent concussion? And this is a big one. Next, please. I remind my wife every time I get in the car to put on the seatbelt. People forget about stuff like this. Can't drive after you've been drinking. That kills so many people, and many of them innocent, because a drunk driver ran up on the sidewalk into a crowd of people. This stuff happens all the time anymore. You have to wear proper prevention equipment, and the helmets have gotten a lot better too. You've probably noticed that. If I'm 80 years old, I look around my house all the time to make sure I'm not going to fall on my head, and make the playground surfaces safer. This has a caveat to that. The artificial playground surfaces and artificial grass that is being used now are highly carcinogenic. So you have to take that into account. The chemicals in that fake grass produce tumors. Next, or can produce tumors. Public education, People ought to know about this stuff. There is interest and curiosity these days that didn't used to be there. Next, please. This in Seattle, we have something called the Zach Lystead law. That CT scan I showed you, the kid who had concussion and then was sent back in, developed a subdural. That's this kid in the bottom here, Zach Lystead. The law in Washington State was enacted because of what happened to him. Next. And this is just him with our department chairman, Rich Ellenbogen, and some Army guys after he got injured. He's still in a wheelchair. Next. Yeah, so in Washington State, and I think in most states in the United States now, there are similar laws requiring the management of concussion and head injury in youth sport. Next. You have to be informed, so parents have to sign a paper regarding concussion prior to the season. Next. And school districts within Washington State have information and policies educating young athletes, coaches, and parents about what they're getting into. Next, please. Next. So athletes who are suspected of a concussion have to be removed to play until they receive written clearance to return to practice by a licensed healthcare physician. Next. And this is a former governor of the state of Washington citing the Zach Lystead bill into law. And again, I think it's law in most states in the United States now. Next, please. Next. 34 states. Yeah, I think it's everywhere now. This talk I made several years ago and I haven't updated it properly, but I think it's all states in the United States. Maybe in the Southeast, they don't, but they don't do a lot of things there. Next. Next. This is just where, yeah, okay. This is just where it's been enacted. Back, next. So how long do you sit them out? Is always a question that is brought up usually by parents. Next. An injured athlete can't go back to practice or games until they've been evaluated, and in writing in Washington it is, by a licensed healthcare provider. Next. That's the law. And next. It's the right thing to do. And I think that's all I got. Yeah. So not sure how many participants we have here, but if anybody has a question, I will answer it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rapport. I don't see any questions yet, but please feel free to put them into the Q&A box, the chat box, use the raise hand feature, and we will get to your questions. We have plenty of time, so please ask us questions. While we wait for you to get your questions in, just a reminder about your CME survey that when you close out of this webinar, you'll have a tab on your browser that you need to click. Can you please go into more detail about auto-regulation blood flow with initial concussion and repeat injury?
Yeah, that's a good question. Your brain does auto-regulate most of the time, and with concussion, particularly significant concussion, and certainly with any blood in the head, that can be lost. It does recover. There's no treatment for loss of autoregulation. It's usually very brief and doesn't necessarily produce serious problems. But that's why people need to be kept for observation to see if anything does come up. Good question. Anything else?
What about screen time? I've always been taught to limit screen time.
Yeah, I've never heard that mentioned, but I think excess in anything is probably to be avoided if you've had a concussion. You put yourself at some hazard. Uh, as I've said, these two women who are investigating CTE, um, I personally think that the pair of them within the next 10 years may very well win the Nobel Prize or at least be nominated for it. The one in Boston who's working on the brain slice imaging, and the one here who's working on the MRs, they will have all of this stuff figured out. They're getting closer and closer. And so it will then be much easier to diagnose and treat. CTE is forever. It's an anatomical change in the substance of brain. It doesn't get better. The patient might get better. The abnormality seen on MR doesn't go away. And that's not something that you want to be carrying around in your head if you don't have to.
Thank you. When doing sports physicals on kids, how do you access for previous head trauma? When do you not approve the sports physical?
Well, there should be a history of a significant injury, although there isn't necessarily always histories in the medical record that primary caregivers might have access to. So, I saw these people way down the line, they weren't getting better after 3 or 4 months. So I didn't have occasion to answer them up front. But if you ask the parents, they're going to tell you. The kid might not, but the parents will tell you.
That's fair. Has there been discussion of modifying the football helmet and football protective gear to make it safer, given the game is still so?
Oh, yes. Yeah. They actually, there was a company founded by somebody at Children's Hospital here in Seattle, which made a very modified and safer football helmet. But the helmets cost something like $3,000 a piece and they went out of business. But if you look carefully, particularly in the NFL games, you will see some players who have an extra cushiony thing on top of their helmet. It's very obvious. So again, kudos to the NFL. They have taken this stuff very seriously and they're doing their best to protect their players. That said, having played football for a lot of years, the goal is to hit the other guy as hard as you can and get more yards or to prevent them from getting more yards. And again, as I said, uh, these running backs are enormous now. They're very fast and powerful, and they're running into people who are immovable, who weigh 350 or 380. So that's an enormous amount of energy coming together, and there's going to be injuries. There just is going to be injuries.
Fair. I'm a Miami Dolphin fan, so I know all about Tua's helmet and what he has.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
It's easy to get hurt in the
yeah,
NFL and even in college. I mean, college football has nothing to do with college anymore.
right.
It's the minor leagues for the pros. And so those guys are big and fast and they want a payday, and I don't blame them.
Fair. How many head traumas will disqualify a kid from playing sports?
3.
Uh, Okay. Do you recommend vestibular rehab or PT?
Uh, that's a good question. And as I've said, I think most of the problems have to do with vestibular injury or so that is probably the first thing, but it depends on their symptoms. If they're complaining of headache, PT isn't going to help them. So you have to be guided by their history and physical.
We're gonna pause. I don't see any questions, but I'm sure you guys have more, so please feel free to type them in. And while we're waiting for you, I'm just going to put a link in the chat box. We have, we're doing our annual provider survey, and this is your chance as the clinicians in our clinics to give us feedback and tell us everything you'd like us to know about MAVEN Project. So if you have a moment and you are a clinic provider, please click this link and complete the survey in addition to your CME survey. And just give us any feedback, what you'd like to see improved, changed, talk about how great our ed sessions are. And the deadline is December 23rd, but if you do this, you can also win a gift card, or you get some, there is some kind of incentive. All right, I did my plug. I don't see any more questions, but still feel free to put them in.
While we're waiting, I'd just like to say that after I retired from the operating room, I started working for MAVEN, which I think is the greatest organization in the country. It's so wonderful to have a body of experienced people who are able to offer advice to clinics for the underserved at no cost. I think that's just wonderful, and I love being able to do this.
I think I'm very biased. I think MAVEN Project is fantastic. So thank you for saying that. And thank you for being one of our volunteers. We do have another question. Do you recommend doing post CT scans, post concussion?
Not necessarily. CT scans are not benign. That's radiation you're given usually to a young brain. If my brain were not 80 years old, I don't think I would want to have it irradiated unless there were a real good reason. If somebody has symptoms beyond headache may persist for a long time, but certainly if they have focal symptoms or signs, then reimaging is fine. I might lean toward trying to get an MR rather than a CT because MRs are magnets and not radiation. It's my strong feeling that you want to irradiate a young head as little as possible. Glioblastoma is not a treatable disease.
Good point. All right. I don't see any more questions.
Okay.
All right.
Thank
So
you very much.
thank you,
And
Dr. Rapport, for being here today. And thank you all for joining us.
thanks, Kristen, for helping me out and getting me
Of course.
past the digital barriers.
The joys of technology.
Yeah.
All right.